Hello. Today I'm joined by James Woodcock, Senior Project Manager at International Symbiosis Limited, a RISERS partner with an extensive hands-on experience in implementing industrial symbiosis with companies across different sectors and regions. We'll be talking today about the challenge of defining industrial symbiosis and why clarity and consistency of terminology matter. So let me start here. Industrial symbiosis is one of those terms that have been around for a while. It's been widely used in discussions about circular economy, resource efficiency, industrial ecology. And yet, if you stop and ask, what exactly do we mean by industrial symbiosis? The answer can vary quite a lot. For some, it's a very concrete term, companies exchanging waste streams, byproducts, energy, water. For others, it's a broader term about collaboration models, about business models, about shared infrastructure, digital platforms, or even regional innovation ecosystems. So we have a concept that's widely recognized, but not always consistently defined. And that's where things are getting interesting. Our RISERS project is focused on standards in support of industrial symbiosis. When you are proposing a standard or standardization, you need terminology that means the same thing across countries, sectors, and professional disciplines. With that in mind, I would like to explore 4 questions on that topic together with you, James. So let's start. Industrial symbiosis had been discussed for decades, as I already mentioned, but still there seems to be a kind of inconsistency in how it's defined and applied. Can you give us some concrete examples of that and explain why that actually matters in practice?
Yeah, certainly. Thanks a lot. As you mentioned, industrial symbiosis has been around a long time, and as an actual reality, it's been around far longer than the term has existed. Things like the chemical industry actually built on the principles of industrial symbiosis, where you've got cascading use of resources. And that's really important to understand that the terminology has been around a few decades, but the processes have been around since the year dot. Now, over that time period, the terminology has evolved and there's been lots of debate. So where are we now? Where we've got multiple descriptions, multiple definitions, lax terminology really, where, as you say, if you've got 2 people having a conversation about industrial symbiosis, they might actually not be talking about the same thing in their heads. They might have different understandings of the language that they're using. So that brings us to this point of view where we need really to have people able to talk to each other on a level playing field. And even if we just think about the term industrial symbiosis itself, that has got many different definitions in academia, in business, in the European Commission. Different parts of the European Commission will actually use it in different ways depending on what they're talking about. So back to in 2018, there was a CWA that was produced, and that production was industry-led. It was an industry-led definition where industry, academia, and other people got together and looked at the various terminology relating to industrial symbiosis. They also looked at things like governance models, how do you actually implement it, and a few other areas. And that really produced a clear definition with clear language about what industrial symbiosis was. But it was a working group that produced this document, and it wasn't necessarily formally adopted across the board. But if we look at that and we can take from that, it gives some of the language that might be most appropriate to use in industrial symbiosis. So I'll give you some examples. So for example, quite often people use terminology like sharing or exchanging resources. And that really can be starting point, an oversimplification, sorry, and it could actually just be plain wrong, in that resources tend to neither be shared, as in two companies using the same resource, or exchanged, because you're not generally giving one company giving a resource and receiving another resource back. What tends to happen is that one company will sell an underutilized resource to another company. Occasionally they might give it away, but on the whole, they'll sell it. So a sharing and exchange is a bit of a misnomer, because you're actually making money from this transaction, and that's probably the best word to use: transaction. It is a transactional process where companies make money from it. Another one is where we tend to talk about materials. That's not that wrong in some sense, in that the vast majority of industrial symbiosis does revolve around materials, but it's much wider than that. It's things like, we use the words underutilized resources, because for us it's not just about materials. It can be about knowledge. It can be about capacity on your production processes, or capacity on a particular machine in your production processes. For example, you might have a machine that grinds waste ceramics, but it doesn't operate 24 hours a day. That means that you can actually sell usage on that machine to somebody else who needs to grind ceramics. And that is where I will actually agree that the use of the terminology share is a good example. But with regards to the materials, it's not share, if that makes sense. So we don't tend to use the word material. We tend much more to focus on the terminology underutilized resources. And then my third and final example really is just a bit of terminology that often crops up when somebody defines what industrial symbiosis is. So they'll say, I'll give you a really bad example: sharing of materials between companies that are geographically closely located with each other. And that brings in this concept of geographical proximity. And by and large, a lot of industrial symbiosis does take place with companies that are close by, but we have to have regard, really, that geographical proximity is related to the value of the resource. So if you're looking at things like aggregates, food, and metals, each one of those has a different value, and metals have much more value than, say, aggregates. So where aggregates might have a smaller geographical distance that they can travel profitably, metals can travel hundreds of miles and still generate a profitable income. And I'm pretty sure that we all agree that a few hundred miles doesn't necessarily mean that the two companies are in geographical proximity to each other. So we have to be careful in what are we looking at, and make sure that we are precise in our language with what we do when we talk about industrial symbiosis.
James, it's a very interesting explanation. I think that we have experienced even those misunderstandings under the RISERS projects, considering the fact that we are engaging with people representing different disciplines, different expertise. We have people from professional backgrounds, such as standardization. We have also experts, industrial experts. We talk to researchers, innovation specialists, practitioners. So how do you see that this diversity influence the way industrial symbiosis has been discussed within the RISERS project?
What was really interesting, as you say, we all came from different backgrounds when we all came together, and we all had different understandings of what we thought industrial symbiosis was. Excuse me. So we all brought our own terminology, our own language with us when we joined this project. And it became quite clear, quite quick, that again, when we were having conversations, we weren't necessarily using the same language, or when we wrote papers and reports, we weren't necessarily all using the same terminology. So what that did is we had a lot of debates really about, do we agree with this word? Do we agree with that terminology? And slowly but surely we came together to get consensus in what we were saying and the language and the terminologies that we were using. And it wasn't necessarily a thou must do this. It was more of a what do we think is most appropriate? Let's look at our language and do we agree with it? Can we justify it? And where do we actually land with each of these bits? And I think what's interesting with RISERS, because as you say, it's centered on standards. And so it was very easy for us all to very quickly recognize that if we are a project centered on standards, it's a good idea that we all have a standard of what we are saying when we are talking about industrial symbiosis, rather than diffuse different language. So on the one side, it was really easy for us to have those conversations because it matched really well with what we were doing as a project. So, and there was very little pushback between the group with regards to let's have this conversation, let's make sure we're using the correct terminology and language. And as a project, I think it has really benefited from doing that, in that right now this project team is all on the same page with what we are doing, with the language that we do and what we are talking about. So it's really benefited the project to go through that process.
And I think that this process is also extremely beneficial for going with those consistency in terminology and definitions beyond, because we are not only communicating within our group, but we are also communicating to our stakeholders that are involved in the standardization processes. So in that context, how the process of working toward the consistency actually changed the way the team itself understand industrial symbiosis, and how do you see and the way forward with conveying that knowledge, this consistency towards the stakeholders? I mean here our standardization roadmap.
Yeah, so as a project, we looked at setting up various working groups, looking at different types of resource and how they would interact with industrial symbiosis and standards with them. Because of the conversations that we've been having within the project, we recognised that we needed some horizontal, some cross-cutting working groups, one of which was this, well, what is industrial symbiosis? So it was really good that we'd gone through that process, because when we set these working groups up, we very quickly said, we need to look at these other aspects as well. Now, what was good with that is that we weren't providing the answers. We weren't being dictatorial. We were actually having as many people as possible who wanted to join those groups and said, let's look at what the issues are and how we might address these issues. Now, what's important to understand is that RISERS is not providing a standard. We are providing a roadmap for standards in industrial symbiosis. So we're sort of like highlighting issues, saying what needs to be considered and suggesting ways that these might be addressed, but we're not producing the actual answer.
And sorry for interrupting, but actually the terminology issue and the understanding of the common terms is one of the items on our agenda that should be somehow covered by standards. And we, as you said, we had a very solid background. This is the SEN workshop agreement that you referred to at the beginning when answered the first question, that already provides a solid foundation concerning the terminology and understanding of industrial symbiosis. But we're trying to bring it a little bit forward. We have prepared, and this is where what we recommend others to take a look at, the glossary of terms, trying to provide a better understanding on the terms and definitions that accompany industrial symbiosis, just for the clarity of having the concept being well understood. So that's a strong point of our research and on our standardization roadmap.
Absolutely, and it's important to understand that that glossary of terms has come from things like, as you say, the SEN workshop agreement. That was our Bible. It was our starting point, really, but also taking soundings from people within that working group. And that glossary really has terminology that we say this is a strong terminology, and then these are weak terminologies. If you're going to talk about industrial symbiosis and you use these types of terminologies, these are pretty weak with regards to if you were going to describe it. So, for example, strong terminology, as I've mentioned, transactions, underutilized resources. Weaker terms would be things like just byproducts, geographical proximity. If you're talking about resource matching platforms, that would be the strong terminology. A weak terminology would call it a waste exchange platform, for example. And then there's terms that we say we shouldn't really use these. These aren't really appropriate. They may well have been used, but we think they're terms that shouldn't be. And that's where you've got things like sharing, exchange, waste, things like that. Now,
James, I
also,
think that
sorry.
we have encouraged already people to take interested in dealing with industrial symbiosis and interested in the works of our project and the standardization to take a look at this glossary that will be provided on the website. James, finally, going back to this terminology developments and looking ahead, where do you see this going? Do you think we're moving towards a more agreed, globally accepted definition? Or is industrial symbiosis always going to remain somewhat context dependent?
I think it will evolve, but I am concerned that some of the evolution of the language with regards to industrial symbiosis might muddy the waters even more. I'll give you an example here. So, and this is my personal opinion. This is not necessarily the RISERS view on this, but this is my personal opinion. So we're now getting the term industrial urban symbiosis, which is where you have industrial symbiosis, but it also includes, say, an urban aspect, whether it's district heating or shared distribution systems. Now, I've been in the game for well over 20 years now with industrial symbiosis, and I've regularly had examples where that has been the case, but we still called it industrial symbiosis. And even the term industrial urban symbiosis has not been buttoned down. Some people call it urban industrial symbiosis. So I personally view that as a term that muddies the waters and makes it more difficult to actually get at information, because some people might call it IUS and some people might just call it IS. So we kind of fractionating something that hasn't even been established yet. So that's one example. But what I do think is a good thing is that we've got various things coming across that are seeking to nail things down and make it a bit more concrete. So, for example, we've got our own project, which is seeking to do a roadmap of industrial symbiosis standardization. And that is looking at this as we've been discussing. We've got technical committees that in Europe that are looking at industrial symbiosis, and I'm thinking particularly TC 465, which is sustainable cities. That is looking at producing an actual industrial symbiosis standard. Now that's going to bring absolute clarity, and their starting point really is, again, like we did, starting with the SEN workshop agreement, the CWA, and using that as a starting point and seeing is that fit for purpose. And a lot of it is, some of it might not be. Yeah, it defines governance models, how you actually implement industrial symbiosis. And I think we now recognise that the 4 governance models included in the CWA are not necessarily totally fit for purpose. Some of them might not even be a governance model, it might be a support mechanism. And there's certainly not hard lines between the different governance models that are explained. So the terminology there will evolve. And then, of course, we've got the Circular Economy Act coming. And that, I think, is a good opportunity again to bring this terminology into a regulation where it can bring clarity at an EU level. I mentioned earlier where if we talk to different departments within the European Commission, you might get different language terminology and talking about different things when you're talking about industrial symbiosis. The Circular Economy Act, the Sustainable Cities Standard, those together might bring this clarity that helps people when you're having this conversation. You know, you've got something that you can point to and say, look, I know there's 13 different, for example, 13 different definitions of IS, but this is where we're going to be when we're having our conversations. And that can only be a good thing. So I'm really holding out hope that we get a standard definition, we get good terminology, and what that will bring is an expansion of the reach and the implementation of industrial symbiosis throughout Europe and throughout the world. And bringing this back to RISERS, I think the work that we've been doing will become a key part of that progress and eventually what we see delivered.
So I think that with this, I would like to finish this short podcast. And thank you very much for all your contributions.
Thanks a lot.